The crowd that stood in the road outside the university gates must have numbered several hundred men and women. It was larger than the sound of it had led us to expect, and for the first time I realised how much quieter and more inactive a crowd of blind people is than a comparably sized crowd of the sighted. It is natural, of course, for they must depend almost entirely on their ears to know what is happening, so that the quietness of each is to the advantage of all, but it had not been obvious to me until that moment. Whatever was going on was right at the front. We managed to find a slightly higher mound which gave us a view of the gates across the heads of the crowd. A man in a cap was talking volubly through the bars. He did not appear to be making a lot of headway, for the part taken in the conversation by the man on the other side of the gates consisted almost entirely of negative headshakes. "What is it?" Josella asked in a whisper. I helped her up beside me. The talkative man turned so that we had a glimpse of his profile. He was, I judged, about 30, with a straight, narrow nose and rather bony features. What showed of his hair was dark, but it was the intensity of his manner that was more noticeable than his appearance. As the colloquy through the gates continued to get nowhere, his voice became louder and more emphatic, though without visible effect on the other. There could be no doubt that the man beyond the gates was able to see. He was doing so watchfully, through horn-rimmed glasses. A few yards behind him stood a little knot of 3 more men, about whom there was equally little doubt. They, too, were regarding the crowd and its spokesman with careful attention. The man on the outside grew more heated. His voice rose as if he were talking as much for the benefit of the crowd as for those behind the railings. "Now listen to me," he said angrily. "These people here have got as much bloody right to live as you have, haven't they? It's not their fault they're blind, is it? It's nobody's fault. But it's going to be your fault if they starve, and you know it." His voice was a curious mixture of the rough and the educated, so that it was hard to place him, as though neither style seemed quite natural to him somehow. "I've been showing them where to get food. I've been doing what I can for them, but Christ, there's only one of me, and there's thousands of them. You could be showing them where to get food too, but are you? Ah, hell. What are you doing about it? Damn all, that's what. Just sweet F.A., but look after your own lousy skins. I've met your kind before. It's damn you, Jack, I'm all right. That's your motto." He spat with contempt and raised a long oratorical arm. "Out there," he said, waving his hand towards London at large, "out there are thousands of poor devils only wanting someone to show them how to get the food that's there for the taking. And you could do it. All you've got to do is show them. But do you? Do you, you buggers? No. No, what you do is shut yourselves in here and let them bloody well starve, when each one of you could keep hundreds alive by doing no more than coming out and showing the poor sods where to get the grub. God almighty, aren't you people human?" The man's voice was violent. He had a case to put, and he was putting it passionately. I felt Josella's hand unconsciously clutching my arm, and I put my hand over hers. The man on the far side of the gate said something that was inaudible where we stood. "How long?" shouted the man on our side. "How in hell would I know how long the food's going to last? What I do know is that if bastards like you don't muck in and help, there ain't going to be many left alive by the time they come to clear this bloody mess up." He stood glaring for a moment. "Fact of it is, you're scared. Scared to show 'em where the food is. And why? Because the more these poor devils get to eat, the less there's going to be for your lot. That's the way of it, isn't it? That's the truth, if you had the guts to admit it." Again we failed to hear the answer of the other man, but whatever it was, it did nothing to mollify the speaker. He stared back grimly through the bars for a moment. Then he said, "All right, if that's the way you want it." He made a lightning snatch between the bars and caught the other's arm. In one swift movement he dragged it through and twisted it. He grabbed the hand of a blind man standing beside him and clamped it on the arm. "Hang on there, mate," he said, and jumped towards the main fastening of the gates. The man inside recovered from his first surprise. He struck wildly through the bars behind him with his other hand. A chance swipe took the blind man in the face. It made him give a yell and tighten his grip. The leader of the crowd was wrenching at the gate fastening. At that moment, a rifle cracked. The bullet pinged against the railings and whirred off on a ricochet. The leader checked suddenly, undecided. Behind him there was an outbreak of curses and a scream or two. The crowd swayed back and forth as though uncertain whether to run or to charge the gates. The decision was made for them by those in the courtyard. I saw a youngish-looking man tuck something under his arm, and I dropped down, pulling Josella with me as the clatter of the submachine gun began. It was obvious that the shooting was deliberately high. Nevertheless, the rattle of it and the whiz of glancing bullets was alarming. One short burst was enough to settle the matter. When we raised our heads, the crowd had lost entity, and its components were groping their ways to safer parts in all three possible directions. The leader paused only to shout something unintelligible, then he turned away too. He made his way northwards up Mallet Street, doing his best to rally his following behind him. I sat where we were and looked at Josella. She looked thoughtfully back at me, and then down at the ground before her. It was some minutes before either of us spoke. "Well?" I asked at last. She raised her head to look across the road, and then at the last stragglers from the crowd pathetically fumbling their ways. "He was right," she said. "You know he was right, don't you?" I nodded. Yes, he was right. And yet he was quite wrong, too. You see, there is no they to come to clear up this mess. I'm quite sure of that now. It won't be cleared up. We could do as he says. We could show some, though only some, of these people where there is food. We could do that for a few days, maybe for a few weeks, but after that, what? It seems so awful, so callous. If we face it squarely, there's a simple choice, I said. Either we can set out to save what can be saved from the wreck, and that has to include ourselves, or we can devote ourselves to stretching the lives of these people a little longer. That's the most objective view I can take. But I can see, too, that the more obviously humane course is also probably the road to suicide. Should we spend our time in prolonging misery when we believe that there is no chance of saving the people in the end? Would that be the best use to make of ourselves? She nodded slowly. Put like that, there doesn't seem to be much choice, does there? And even if we could save a few, which are we going to choose? And who are we to choose? And how long could we do it anyway? There's nothing easy about this, I said. I've no idea what proportion of semi-disabled persons it may be possible for us to support when we come to the end of handy supplies, but I don't imagine it could be very high. You've made up your mind, she said, glancing at me. There might or might not have been a tinge of disapproval in her voice. My dear, I said, I don't like this any more than you do. I've put the alternatives boldly before you. Do we help those who have survived the catastrophe to rebuild some kind of life? Or do we make a moral gesture which on the face of it can scarcely be more than a gesture? The people across the road there evidently intend to survive. She dug her fingers into the earth and let the soil trickle out of her hand. I suppose you're right, she said. But you're right when you say I don't like it. Our likes and dislikes as decisive factors have now pretty well disappeared, I suggested. Maybe, but I can't help feeling that there must be something wrong about anything that starts with shooting. He shot to miss, and it's very likely he saved fighting, I pointed out. The crowd had all gone now. I climbed over the wall and helped Josella down on the other side. A man at the gate opened it to let us in. "How many of you?" he asked. "Just two of us. We saw your signal last night," I told him. "OK, come along and we'll find the Colonel," he said, leading us across the forecourt. The man whom he called the Colonel had set himself up in a small room not far from the entrance, and intended, seemingly, for the porters. He was a chubby man, just turned 50 or thereabout. His hair was plentiful but well trimmed and grey. His moustache matched it, and looked as if no single hair would dare to break the ranks. His complexion was so pink, healthy and fresh that it might have belonged to a much younger man. His mind, I discovered later, had never ceased to do so. He was sitting behind a table with quantities of paper arranged on it in mathematically exact blocks, and an unsoiled sheet of pink blotting paper placed squarely before him. As we came in, he turned upon us, one after the other, an intense, steady look, and held it a little longer than was necessary. I recognized the technique. It is intended to convey that the user is a percipient judge, accustomed to taking summarily the measure of his man. The receiver should feel that he now faces a reliable type with no nonsense about him, or, alternatively, that he's been seen through and had all his weaknesses noted. The right response is to return it in kind and be considered a useful fella. I did. The Colonel picked up his pen. "Your names, please?" We gave them.
And addresses?
In the present circumstances, I fear they won't be very useful, I said. But if you really feel you must have them. We gave them too. He murmured something about system, organisation, and relatives, and wrote them down. Age, occupation, and all the rest of it followed. He bent his searching look upon us again, scribbled a note upon each piece of paper, and put them in a file.
Need good men. Nasty business, this. Plenty to do here, though, plenty. Mr. Beadley'll tell you what's wanted.
We came out into the hall again. Josella giggled. He forgot to ask for references in triplicate, but I gather we've got the job, she said. Michael Beadley, when we discovered him, turned out to be in decided contrast. He was lean, tall, broad-shouldered, and slightly stooping with something of the air of an athlete run to books. In repose his face took on an expression of mild gloom from the darkness of his large eyes, but it was seldom that one had a glimpse of it in repose. The occasional streaks of grey in his hair helped very little in judging his age. He might have been anything between 35 and 50. His obvious weariness just then made an estimate still more difficult. By his looks he must have been up all night. Nevertheless, he greeted us cheerfully and waved an introductory hand towards a young woman who took down our names again as we gave them.
Sandra Telmont, he explained. Sandra is our professional remembrancer. Continuity is her usual work, so we regard it as particularly thoughtful of Providence to contrive her presence here just now.
The young woman nodded to me and looked harder at Josella. "We've met before," she said thoughtfully. She glanced down at the pad on her knee. Presently a faint smile passed across her pleasant, though unexotic countenance. "Oh, yes, of course," she said in recollection. "What did I tell you? The thing clings like a fly-paper," Josella observed to me.
"What's this about?"
inquired Michael Beadley. I explained. He turned a more careful scrutiny on Josella. She sighed. "Please forget it," she suggested. "I'm a bit tired of living it down." That appeared to surprise him agreeably.
"All right," he said, and dismissed the matter with a nod. He turned back to the table. "Now, to get on with things, you've seen Jack?"
"If that is the colonel who is playing at civil service, we have," I told him. He grinned.
"Got to know how we stand. Can't get anywhere without knowing your ration strength," he said in a fair imitation of the colonel's manner. "But it's quite true, though," he went on. "I'd better give you just a rough idea of how things do stand. Up to the present there are about 35 of us, all sorts. We hope and expect that some more will come in during the day. Out of those here now, 28 can see. The others are wives or husbands, and there are 2 or 3 children who cannot. At the moment the general idea is that we move away from here sometime tomorrow, if we can be ready in time. To be on the safe side, you understand?"
I nodded. "We'd decided to get away this evening for the same reason," I told him.
"What have you for transport?"
I explained the present position of the station wagon. "We were going to stock up today," I added. "So far we've practically nothing except a quantity of anti-Triffid gear." He raised his eyebrows. The girl Sandra also looked at me curiously.
"That's a queer thing to make your first essential," he remarked.
I told them the reasons. Possibly I made a bad job of it, for they neither of them looked much impressed. He nodded casually and went on.
"Well, if you're coming in with us, here's what I suggest. Bring in your car, dump your stuff, then drive off and swap it for a good big lorry. Then, does either of you know anything about doctoring?" he broke off to ask.
We shook our heads. He frowned a little.
That's a pity. So far we've got no one who does. It'll surprise me if we're not needing a doctor before long. And anyway, we ought all of us to have inoculations. Still, it's not much good sending you 2 off on a medical supply scrounge. What about food and general stores? Suit you?"
He flipped through some pages on a clip, detached one of them, and handed it to me. It was headed number 15, and below was a typed list of canned goods, pots and pans, and some bedding.
"Not rigid," he said, "but keep reasonably close to it, and we'll avoid too many duplications. Stick to best quality. With the food, concentrate on value for bulk. I mean, even if cornflakes are your leading passion in life, forget 'em. I suggest you keep to warehouses and big wholesalers."
He took back the list and scribbled 2 or 3 addresses on it.
"Cans and packets are your food line. Don't get led away by sacks of flour, for instance. There's another party on that sort of stuff."
He looked thoughtfully at Josella.
"Heaviest work, I'm afraid, but it's the most useful job we can give you at present. Do as much as you can before dark. There'll be a general meeting and discussion here about 9:30 this evening."
As we turned to go,
Got a pistol?" he asked.
"I didn't think of it," I admitted.
"Better, just in case. Quite effective, simply fired into the air," he said.
He took 2 pistols from a drawer in the table and pushed them across.
"Less messy than that,"
he added, with a look at Josella's handsome knife.
"Good scrounging to you."
Even by the time we set out after unloading the station wagon, we found that there were still fewer people about than on the previous day. The ones that were showed an inclination to get on the pavements at the sound of the engine rather than to molest us. The first lorry to take our fancy proved useless, being filled with wooden cases too heavy for us to remove. Our next find was luckier, a 5-tonner, almost new and empty. We transshipped and left the station wagon to its fate. At the first address on my list, the shutters of the loading bay were down, but they gave way without much difficulty to the persuasions of a crowbar from a neighbouring shop and rolled up easily. Inside we made a find. 3 lorries stood backed up to the platform. One of them was fully loaded with cases of canned meat. "Can you drive one of these things?" I asked Josella. She looked at it.
"Well, I don't see why not. The general idea is the same, isn't it? And there's certainly no traffic problem."
We decided to come back and fetch it later, and took the empty lorry onto another warehouse where we loaded parcels of blankets, rugs and quilts, and then went on further to acquire a noisy miscellany of pots, pans, cauldrons and kettles. When we had it filled, we felt we'd put in a good morning's work on a job that was heavier than we'd thought. We satisfied the appetite it had given us at a small pub hitherto untouched. The mood which filled the business and commercial districts was gloomy, though it was a gloom that still had more the style of a normal Sunday or public holiday than of collapse. Very few people at all were to be seen in those parts. Had the catastrophe come by day instead of by night after the workers had gone home, it would have been a hideously different scene. When we had refreshed ourselves, we collected the already loaded lorry from the food warehouse and drove the 2 of them slowly and uneventfully back to the university. We parked them in the forecourt there and set off again. About 6:30 we returned once more with another pair of well-loaded lorries and a feeling of useful accomplishment. Michael Beadley emerged from the building to inspect our contributions. He approved of it all, save 6 cases that I'd added to my second load.
"What are they?"
he asked. "Triffid guns and bolts for them," I told him. He looked at me thoughtfully.
"Oh, yes, you arrived with a lot of anti-Triffid stuff," he remarked.
"I think it's likely we'll need it," I said. He considered. I could see that I was being put down as a bit unsound on the subject of Triffids. Most likely he was accounting for that by the bias my job might be expected to give, aggravated by a phobia resulting from my recent sting, and he was wondering whether it might connote other, perhaps less harmless unsoundnesses. "Look here," I suggested. "We've brought in 4 full loads between us. I just want enough space in one of them for these cases. If you think we can't spare that, I'll go out and find a trailer or another lorry."
"No, leave them where they are. They don't take a lot of room," he decided.
We went into the building and had some tea at an improvised canteen that a pleasant-faced, middle-aged woman had competently set up there. "He thinks," I said to Josella, "that I've got a bee in my bonnet over Triffids."
"He'll learn, I'm afraid," she replied. "It's queer that no one else seems to have seen them about."
"These people have all been keeping pretty much to the centre, so it's not very surprising. After all, we've seen none ourselves today."
"Do you think they'll come right down here among the streets?"
"I couldn't say. Maybe lost ones would."
"How do you think they got loose?" she asked.
"If they worry at a stake hard enough and long enough, it'll usually come in the end. The breakouts we used to get sometimes on the farms were due as a rule to their all crowding up against one section of the fence until it gave way."
"But couldn't you make the fences stronger?"
"We could have done, but we didn't want them fixed quite permanently. It didn't happen very often, and when it did, it was usually simply from one field to another, so we'd just drive them back and put up the fence again. I don't think any of them will intentionally make this way. From a Triffid point of view, a city must be much like a desert, so I should think they'll be moving outwards towards the open country on the whole." "Have you ever used a Triffid gun?" I added. She shook her head. "After I've done something about these clothes, I was thinking of putting in a bit of practice if you'd like to try," I suggested. I got back an hour or so later, feeling more suitably clad as a result of having infringed on her idea of a ski suit and heavy shoes, to find that she had changed into a becoming dress of spring green. We took a couple of the Triffid guns and went out into the garden of Russell Square close by. We had spent about half an hour snipping the topmost shoots off convenient bushes when a young woman in a brick-red lumber jacket and an elegant pair of green trousers strolled across the grass and levelled a small camera at us. "Who are you? The press?" inquired Josella. "More or less," said the young woman. "At least, I'm the official record, Elspeth Carey." "So soon?" I remarked. "I trace the hand of our order-conscious colonel." "You're quite right," she agreed. She turned to look at Josella. "And you are Miss Playton. I've often wondered—" "Now look here," interrupted Josella. "Why should the one static thing in a collapsing world be my reputation? Can't we forget it?" Said Miss Carey thoughtfully. "Uh-huh." She turned to another subject. "What's all this about Triffids?" she asked. We told her. "They think," added Josella, "that Bill here is either scary or scatty on the subject." Miss Carey turned a straight look at me. Her face was interesting rather than good-looking, with a complexion browned by stronger suns than ours. Her eyes were steady, observant, and dark brown. "Are you?" she asked. "Well, I think they're troublesome enough to be taken seriously when they get out of hand," I told her. She nodded. "True enough. I've been in places where they are out of hand. Quite nasty. But in England, well, it's hard to imagine that here." "There'll not be a lot to stop them here now," I said. Her reply, if she had been about to make one, was forestalled by the sound of an engine overhead. We looked up and presently saw a helicopter come drifting across the roof of the British Museum. "That'll be Ivan," said Miss Carey. "He thought he might manage to find one. I must go and get a picture of him landing. See you later." And she hurried off across the grass. Josella lay down, clasped her hands behind her head, and gazed up into the depths of the sky. When the helicopter's engine ceased, it sounded very much quieter than before we'd heard it. "I can't believe it," she said. "I try, but I still can't really believe. It can't all be going. This is some kind of dream. Tomorrow this garden will be full of noise. The red buses will be roaring along over there. Crowds of people will be scurrying along the pavements. The traffic lights will be flashing. The world doesn't just end like this. It can't. It isn't possible." I was feeling like that too. The houses, the trees, the absurdly grandiose hotels on the other side of the square were all too normal, too ready to come to life at a touch. "And yet," I said, "I suppose that if they had been able to think at all, the dinosaurs would have thought much the same thing. It just does happen from time to time, you see." "But why to us? It's like reading in the papers about the astonishing things that have happened to other people, but always to other people. There's nothing special about us." "Isn't there always a why me? Whether it's the soldier who's untouched when all his pals are killed, or the fellow who gets run in for fiddling his accounts. Just plain blind chance, I'd say." "Chance that it happened? Or chance that it happened now?" "Now, I mean. It was bound to happen sometime, in some way. It's an unnatural thought that one type of creature should dominate perpetually." "I don't see why." "Why is a heck of a question. But it is an inescapable conclusion that life has to be dynamic and not static. Change is bound to come one way or another. Mind you, I don't think it's quite done with us this time, but it has had a damn good try." "Then you don't think it really is the end? Of people, I mean?" "It might be, but, well, I don't think so. This time." It could be the end. I had no doubt of that. But there would be other little groups like ours. I saw an empty world with a few scattered communities trying to fight their way back to control of it. I had to believe that some, at least, of them would succeed. "No," I repeated. "It need not be the end. We're still very adaptable, and we've a flying start compared with our ancestors. As long as there are any of us left sound and healthy, we've got a chance. A thundering good chance." Josella made no answer. She lay facing upwards with a faraway look in her eyes. I thought perhaps I could guess something of what was passing in her mind, but I said nothing. She did not speak for a little while. Then she said, "You know, One of the most shocking things about it is to realise how easily we have lost a world that seemed so safe and certain. She was quite right. It was that simplicity that seemed somehow to be the nucleus of the shock. From very familiarity, one forgets all the forces which keep the balance and thinks of security as normal. It is not. I don't think it had ever before occurred to me that man's supremacy is not primarily due to his brain, as most of the books would have one think. It is due to the brain's capacity to make use of the information conveyed to it by a narrow band of visible light rays. His civilization, all that he has achieved or might achieve, hangs upon his ability to perceive that range of vibrations from red to violet. Without that, he is lost. I saw for a moment the true tenuousness of his hold on his power, the miracles that he had wrought with such a fragile instrument. Josella had been pursuing her own line of thought. It's going to be a very queer sort of world, what's left of it. I don't think we're going to like it a lot, she said reflectively. It seemed to me an odd view to take, rather as if one should protest that one did not like the idea of dying or being born. I preferred the notion of finding out first how it would be, and then doing what one could about the parts of it one disliked most, but I let it pass. From time to time we had heard the sound of lorries driving up to the far side of the building. It was evident that most of the foraging parties must have returned by this hour. I looked at my watch and reached for the Triffids guns lying on the grass beside me. If we're going to get any supper before we hear what other people feel about all this, it's time we went in, I said. Chapter 7. Conference. I fancy all of us had expected the meeting to be simply a kind of briefing talk, just times, course instructions, the day's objective, that kind of thing. Certainly I had no expectation of the food for thought that we received. It was held in a small lecture theatre lit for the occasion by an arrangement of car headlamps and batteries. When we went in, some half-dozen men and 2 women who appeared to have constituted themselves a committee were conferring behind the lecturer's desk. To our surprise, we found nearly 100 people seated in the body of the hall. Young women predominated at a ratio of about 4 to 1. I had not realised until Josella pointed it out to me how few of them were able to see. Michael Beadley dominated the consulting group by his height. I recognised the colonel beside him. The other faces were new to me, save that of Elspeth Carey, who had now exchanged her camera for a notebook, presumably for the benefit of posterity. Most of their interest was centred round an elderly man of ugly but benign aspect, who wore gold-rimmed spectacles and fine white hair trimmed to a rather political length. They all had an air of being a little worried about him. The other woman in the party was little more than a girl, perhaps 22 or 3. She did not appear happy at finding herself where she was. She cast occasional looks of nervous uncertainty at the audience. Sandra Telmont came in, carrying a sheet of foolscap. She studied it a moment, then briskly broke the group up and sorted it into chairs. With a wave of her hand she directed Michael to the desk, and the meeting began. He stood there a little bent, watching the audience from sombre eyes as he waited for the murmuring to die down. When he spoke, it was in a pleasant, practised voice, and with a fireside manner. "Many of us here," he began, "must still be feeling numbed under this catastrophe. The world we knew has ended in a flash. Some of us may be feeling that it is the end of everything. It is not. But to all of you, I will say at once that it can be the end of everything if we let it."